States is crucial at this juncture. We must ensure that a comprehensive agreement between the two parties is not imposed and oppose unilateral actions by either of the two parties that would push the prospects for peace further out of reach. To that end, we stand ready to help facilitate an environment that fosters the resumption of direct peace negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians in order to achieve a viable, lasting, and mutually agreed-upon two-state solution. Sincerely. It was organized by David Price and Jerry Conley, signed by 191 members of Congress, 189 Democrats. I wanted to read you the letter directly because I wanted you to hear it as written, not out of context. And I wanted to read it to you in the spirit of strong support for a Jewish, secure, and democratic Israel. An Israel that recognizes the dignity and the security of both the Palestinians and the Israelis. That is the Israel we know and love as friends, allies, and advocates for Israel. That is the future we must continue to champion. And when people sometimes say to me, the United States is so overwhelmingly partial to Israel in this discussion, I say, yes, of course. We have been friends for a long time. We have shared values. And we are friends. So we don't want to interfere in the negotiation, impose anything, but we do share the values of a secure, democratic, Jewish Israel. That is why I hope we can come together on efforts to oppose boycott, divestment, and sanctions. We must. That is why we must come together on efforts to counter the Iranian ballistic missile threat, building on the Obama administration's leadership in imposing unilateral sanctions more than a year ago. And I want to commend the Obama administration for its support of sharing intelligence and making sure that in a stronger way than ever before that Israel had the qualitative advantage in its military capabilities. We must stand united in opposition to Iran's support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and other regional proxies' aggressions. Today, I want to say thank you to all of you, not only for your commitment to the U.S.-Israel partnership, but for championing the foreign aid dollars that alleviate poverty, eradicate disease, and promote peace. AIPAC has been a champion in doing that. Last week, I had generals visit me in my office, generals, and advocating against the 30% cut to our diplomatic budget in the president's budget blueprint. They said, and we know, we owe it to our men and women in uniform to avoid conflict. We know that it's important for us to build bridges of confidence with countries. We know it is important that issues like PEPFAR, that's the spread of the AIDS drug that President Bush took such pride in, that we worked with him in issues like that build confidence in our relationships in countries, make friends. We owe it again to our men and women in uniform to avoid conflict. But when we have to go, we need to have friends to do so. As General Mattis testified recently, he said, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I need to buy more ammunition. That's just not what we should be doing as we allocate our resources. Foreign aid for Israel is sacred. We know that. That is sacred. But the president's budget cuts would devastate the U.S.'s leadership in the region and around the world. Today, your voices and wisdom are more important than ever, and I know that you will be storming the Hill shortly after these sessions Together, we will ensure that the unbreakable friendship between the United States and Israel is forever, a friendship dedicated to peace, to justice, to a future of success for all. On behalf of my colleagues and the House, I say thank you, AIPAC, for inviting me to join you, but more importantly, for advancing the cause of a thriving U.S.-Israel relationship. Together we will work, our work will continue, our alliance will grow deeper, the friendship between the United States and Israel will stand strong now and forever. May God bless Israel, may God bless the United States of America, may God bless you all. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Please welcome from the 2nd Congressional District of Arizona, Martha McSally.
Good morning, AIPAC. David and Goliath, the original underdog story. A plucky young warrior defeats a giant with only his staff, a sling, and a handful of stones. That story reminds us that with courage and faith, we can overcome any odds. Today, the state of Israel is a modern-day David, and Goliath is the arsenal of hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles aimed at the Jewish state by terror groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. But this time, Israel has a major upgrade in technology that will help it take down the next giant. Amen. The David Sling Missile Defense System, which was co-developed by Israel's Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and the American defense contractor Raytheon. When it goes online later this year, David Sling will play a critical role in Israel's missile defense network. While Iron Dome has proven effective at intercepting the short-range rockets, David Sling safeguards Israelis from medium-range ballistic missiles, long-range artillery rockets, drones, and cruise missiles. That is, simply put, a game changer. Israel's Homefront Command estimates that during a conflict, Hezbollah could fire more than 1,000 rockets a day into Israel's north. A comprehensive multi-tiered missile defense system ensures that both civilians and critical infrastructure are protected from the full spectrum of attacks. The system more than triples the range of Iron Dome and deploys in a variety of settings, giving civilians critical protections in areas of the country outside the umbrella of Iron Dome batteries. And as a supporter of a close U.S.-Israel alliance, I couldn't be more proud that a crucial component of the David Sling missile, the Stunner Interceptor, was developed by Raytheon in my district in Tucson, Arizona. Do you know the United States has committed $1.1 billion in research and development funding for the David Sling system over the past decade? As co-developers of this project, we gain valuable insight into technology that improves our own systems, and it keeps Americans safe too. As a retired Air Force colonel and an A-10 Warthog pilot, that's the plane I flew right there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And as someone who deployed to the Middle East and Afghanistan 6 times, and as a member of the House Armed Services Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, I've dedicated my life to protecting our country and ensuring a safer world for our allies. Thank you. That's why I am a proud and vocal supporter of U.S. security assistance to Israel. partnership with Israel ensures American interests in the Middle East are protected by our friend who shares our commitment to democracy and human rights. And U.S. annual security assistance to Israel, which you all advocate for, comprises a significant portion of Israel's defense budget. In addition to that, the U.S. Missile Defense Agency works with their Israeli counterparts to ensure that the Jewish state purchases missile defense technology built right here in America to keep its citizens safe and secure. Those purchases add up. Raytheon, in my district, employs about 10,000 people in Tucson and works with more than 500 suppliers across the state. And Israeli purchases contribute to a major portion of the $2.1 billion economic impact that Raytheon brings to Arizona each year. If Israel is a modern-day David, I'm glad to know that my district and my state play a crucial role in ensuring that our hero comes to the fight better equipped than ever before. Because David's sling helps Arizona develop new technologies. They boost our economy and they keep all our citizens safe and secure. And that's Israel in my state. Thank you all. God bless you.
Good morning, AIPAC. Good morning. What an honor. Lillian, congratulations on your outstanding presidency, and it's great to be with you again this year. I also want to thank AIPAC's Executive Director, Howard Kaur, and I'm just thrilled to see all of the students in the audience. In you, I see our future. I want to especially recognize the nearly 1,000 Californians who are here today. And of course, including my dear friends and AIPAC board members, Anita Friedman and Sissy Swig and Amy Friedkin. And I'm proud to say and be that among the many voices represented here, the California delegation is the largest and hopefully the loudest. There you go. So, having grown up in the Bay Area, I fondly remember those Jewish National Fund boxes that we would use to collect donations to plant trees for Israel. Years later, when I visited Israel for the first time, I saw the fruits of that effort and the Israeli ingenuity that has truly made a desert bloom. I soaked in the sights and sounds and smells of Jerusalem. I stood in Yad Vashem, devastated by the silent testimonies of the 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust. And we must always remember that solemn promise, never again. And I did what I often do when visiting a new country. I visited the highest court in the land. And as I toured Israel's Supreme Court, I was struck by the iconic architecture, which embodies Israel's founding principles of democracy and rule of law. The design of that building left a lasting impression on me. Its straight lines, which represent the immutable nature of truth, while the curved walls and glass represent the fluid nature of tzedek, of justice. And this is a concept that is personal for me, because it's that same commitment to justice for the voiceless and the vulnerable that led my parents as students to march for civil rights in the 1960s while pushing me in a stroller. And it's why I became a prosecutor and personally prosecuted everything from low-level offenses to homicides. It's why I became San Francisco District Attorney and was later elected Attorney General of California, where I took on, thank you, where I took on transnational gangs, cyber criminals, and mortgage fraud. And that commitment to justice is why I ran to become a United States Senator from the great state of California. The point being to continue that fight. And a critical piece of my agenda is the fight to defend and strengthen our national security. As a member of both the Senate Intelligence Committee and Homeland Security Committee, I have a front row seat to these issues, and I am proud to stand strongly with America's allies, including Israel. So let me be clear about what I believe. I stand with Israel because of our shared values, which are so fundamental to the founding of both our nations. I believe the bonds between the United States and Israel are unbreakable, and we can never let anyone drive a wedge between us. Our bonds are rooted in our shared history and are strengthened by the ties between our peoples. And in the words of Shimon Peres, whose loss we mourn so deeply, for Israel's existence, we need the friendship of the United States of America. And of course, he knew that feeling goes both ways. And there's no question that friendship and our partnership must be unwavering. And I believe that Israel must be, the teleprompter has stopped, and now I'm going to catch it back up. There we are. I believe Israel should never be a partisan issue. And as long as I'm a United States Senator, I will do everything in my power to ensure broad and bipartisan support for Israel's security and right to self-defense. I believe that the only viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is two states for two people living side by side in peace and security. I believe that a resolution to this conflict cannot be imposed. It must be agreed upon by the parties themselves. Peace can only come through a reconciliation of differences, and that can only happen at the negotiating table. I believe that when any organization delegitimizes Israel, we must stand up and speak out for Israel to be treated equally. And that is why the first resolution I co-sponsored as a United States Senator was to combat anti-Israel bias at the United Nations and reaffirm that the United States seeks a just, secure, and sustainable two-state solution. And as someone who has personally prosecuted hate crime, I also believe that we cannot stand by while anti-Semitism, hate crime, and bigotry are on the rise, whether that's a swastika on a Jewish Family and Children's Services bus in San Francisco or the burning of a mosque in Tampa. That's why I am pleased to announce, for the first time here at AIPAC, that I'm introducing a Senate resolution that condemns targeting of Jews as well as any form of religious bias, racism, misogyny, or other hateful acts targeting minorities across the United States. And let's be candid. Many, including those in this hall, have been directly impacted by the outrageous incidents targeting the Jewish community. This violence and hate is alarming and simply unacceptable. No one should have to worry about their children's safety when they dropped them off at the JCC. No one should have to be afraid to put a menorah in their front window or on their front lawn. And no one should ever have to fear that the grave of a loved one might be desecrated because of their faith. So my resolution calls on law enforcement to expedite investigations of hate crime and hold perpetrators accountable. My resolution calls on law enforcement to fully report hate crime statistics. And my resolution calls on the administration to support victims and fund security at places of worship and other institutions that have been targeted, of any faith. And as I fight to promote human rights and security, Israel and the Jewish community will always be a priority for me. And that is why, as Senator, I am particularly focused on 3 areas where I believe the United States and Israel can expand our cooperation and where California plays an important and central role. And the 3 are defense, cybersecurity, and water security. So let's think about it. First, defense. In the midst of uncertainty and turmoil, America's support for Israel's security must be rock solid. And as Iran continues to launch ballistic missiles, while it arms and funds its terrorist proxy Hezbollah, we must stand with Israel. As Hamas maintains its control of Gaza and fires rockets across Israel's southern border, we must stand with Israel. And as ISIS and civil war in Syria destabilize the region, displacing millions and threatening shared security interests, we must support all those affected by ongoing violence and terror, and we must stand with Israel. Our defense relationship is critical to both nations, which is why I support the United States' commitment to provide Israel with $38 billion in military assistance over the next decade. It is why I support full funding for Israel, including for the Arrow, David Sling, and the Iron Dome missile defense systems, which save lives. And that's why I am fully committing to maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. At the same time, the United States must never permit Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. The Iran nuclear deal must be vigorously enforced through robust monitoring, inspection, and verification. And if Iran cheats, there's no question, Iran must be held accountable. And so as Iran inserts itself in Syria, including through the deployment of advanced military equipment and missiles that threaten Israel, we must not tolerate Iran fanning the flames of instability and violence in the region. In addition, Russia's explicit support for these actions is a direct threat to American interests, and it makes Israel less secure. So I say, the Trump administration must be crystal clear with Putin. Russia must stop its support of Iran. This is a threat to the United States, and it is a threat to Israel. A second area where I believe we can expand our cooperation is cybersecurity and technology. As cyber attacks expose the vulnerabilities of our most essential systems and infrastructure, the United States and Israel must strengthen our innovation and technological capacities and our defenses together. Israel has more scientists and startups per capita than any other country in the world. And I'm proud that California, building on the 2014 commitments made by Prime Minister Netanyahu and Governor Brown, has facilitated many of these technological partnerships and investments. Today, Tel Aviv and Silicon Valley are inextricably linked, ensuring that our two countries remain on the cutting edge. And when I met with Prime Minister Netanyahu last month, I was proud to discuss California's cyber advancements and the way we can expand those joint efforts. And the third area of growing cooperation is water security. So as any Californian in this hall can tell you, water is the lifeblood of our economies and our communities. And because of California's history of droughts, we know we cannot take water for granted. In this regard, we could not have a better example than Israel. Yes. Israel is a nation that is 60% desert, yet so water secure that it exports water to its neighbors. And Israel has been a great partner to California in this area. Take, for example, Carlsbad, California, where an Israeli company built a desalination plant which provides 50 million gallons of water to 400,000 Californians every day. So while the United States and Israel are geographically separated by water, we can also be bound by water. And I'm eager to champion these three partnerships in the Senate now and in the future, and to ensure that California plays a key role in the relationship between the United States and Israel. So in conclusion, AIPAC, we all know these are difficult times. I stand here clear-eyed about the dangers of division in our country and in our world, understanding why a state for the Jewish people is so essential. And I also stand here as someone with a lifelong commitment to justice, a lifelong faith in the power of democratic values and the innate oneness and goodness of human beings. And I believe that it's the common ground that unites so many of us. Values like faith, family, respect, and empathy that will see us through. Just look, for example, at the response when Jewish cemeteries in St. Louis and Philadelphia were so horribly vandalized. Muslim activists quickly raised money to restore the headstones, with one organizer posting on social media, quote, "I want to ask all Muslims to reach out to your Jewish brothers and sisters and stand together against this bigotry." Common ground. Look at the words of Elie Wiesel, who I knew personally and loved, when he said, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference." Common ground. Look at Israel's Supreme Court, that beautiful place I visited, upon which sits a Tunisian judge alongside an Israeli Arab Christian and a Brooklyn-born Israeli, all presided over by a female Chief Justice. Common ground. Or look at my own life, where a daughter of a South Asian mother and a Jamaican father, concluded her own interfaith wedding with her husband, breaking a glass and everyone yelling Mazel Tov. So that's who we are. And if we embrace those values that have always made the United States and Israel great, then I believe our two nations will continue to move forward together for years and years to come. I thank you, AIPAC. Thank you.
Please welcome from the state of New Jersey, Senator Robert Menendez.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for that warm welcome. What a pleasure it is to be back at the AIPAC Policy Conference. I feel a little bit like Mariano Rivera of the New York Yankees, always called in to be the successful closer. And that's not easy, but we'll try. Every year when I stand at this podium, when I look out into this convention hall, I see a room full of leaders and advocates I'm proud to call my friends. People like Howard Kohr, your president, President Pincus, Madam President. I thought I was going to say that more often, but I'll say it tonight. Madam President. And, of course, New Jersey's own and your president-elect, Mort Friedman. Mort, congratulations. And the hundreds of AIPAC members here representing the great state of New Jersey who have come down to be with all of you. It is always an honor for me not just to speak with you, but to join hands with you, to be among people of all ages and all faiths and all political persuasions who stand together and stand tall for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, those of you who know me know three things. First, you know I believe that it is in the national interest and security of the United States to have a strong, unwavering, unyielding, unbreakable bond with the State of Israel. Second, you know that I believe in the right of the Jewish people to live in peace and security in the indisputable homeland of their ancestors. And finally, you know that no matter which way the political winds are blowing or which way the news cycle is going, when it comes to standing up for Israel, you will never, ever find me spinning like a weather vane, but rather a strong moral compass that bears due east 5,879 miles from Washington to Jerusalem. You know that I will not be intimidated by political opponents. I will never hesitate to disagree with my closest friends. I will never shy away from standing up to any president of any party. And while I have paid a price for my beliefs, I would do it all over again. Now, recent events have reminded us that we live in challenging times, times that demand free people around the world remain resolute and united in humanity's long struggle against fear and terror and hate. Just this past week, we were saddened by a terrorist attack in the heart of London that killed 5 people and injured 50 others. All it took was 82 seconds. Of course, the Israeli people need no reminder of how quickly an act of terror can unfold. They have lived under the siege for decades, enduring rocket attacks and suicide bombings and street stabbings, always praying for peace, and yet always painfully aware of the reality. A reality that Prime Minister Netanyahu captured so eloquently when he said, if the Arabs put down their weapons today, there would be no more violence. If the Jews put down their weapons today, there would be no more Israel. Those simple words carry a powerful truth, a recognition that Israel can never let its guard down. And that's why last year I was proud to help secure our record-breaking $38 billion Memorandum of Understanding. You all advocated for it. An agreement that ensures that Israel's defenses will remain unmatched in the region, and that together the United States and Israel will continue developing defense technologies of astounding sophistication like Iron Dome, David Sling, and the Arrow 3 missile defense systems. That's also why I will continue to stand against budgets that propose that we defund U.S. foreign aid entirely, because in addition to the security assistance we provide allies like Israel, we know that when America promotes human rights and women's rights globally, when we bring economic opportunity to where there is poverty, when we promote education over extremism, both the United States and Israel reap the benefits of greater stability and security. So as AIPAC members, as you work to ensure continued military assistance for Israel, I want to thank you and commend you for also advocating that the United States continue to fully fund foreign aid and diplomatic outreach as well. Now, as AIPAC members, you understand the gravity of the challenges that confront us, both for our national security and the security of Israel. Today, we see extremism and hate casting dark shadows around the world. We see a cynical, intentional effort to delegitimize the state of Israel in the international community, in the global economy, and even academia. And finally, we see an Iranian regime that has, in my view, quite predictably, been emboldened by sanctions relief and more committed to ever to destabilizing the Middle East. Each of these threats are serious in and of themselves, but to have them converging all at once should make one thing clear. In times like these, we cannot afford a shred of daylight between the United States and Israel. And that's why earlier this year, I refused to stand silent when the United States abstained from a UN Security Council vote that was unabashedly biased against Israel and ultimately detrimental to the cause of peace. That's why I co-sponsored Senate Resolution 6, strongly objecting to its passage. The UN Security Council can't pass a resolution condemning Iran's violation of ballistic missile testing. It can't pass a resolution to stop the humanitarian strife in Syria. It can't condemn Russia for indiscriminately bombing civilians in Aleppo. And yet it endorses a biased resolution that pins every wrong in the Middle East on the one nation that stands up for what is right. And that is wrong. A resolution that allows terrorist organizations like Hamas to shrink any responsibility in the routine incitement of Palestinian violence. A resolution that emboldens hardliners who will cease to advance their own agendas. It was wrong to betray our long-standing commitment to defending Israel on the world stage, precisely because it is our one reliable and steadfast ally in the Middle East. It was wrong to condone a biased resolution that treats Israel as the source of all things broken in the region. And it was wrong to abstain at a moment when the world needs the United States of America to stand up for our values, to speak up for our allies, and to lead by the power of our example. Unfortunately, the United Nations is not the only place where Israel confronts this double standard, a double standard that increasingly seems little more than anti-Semitism in disguise. Which leads me to address directly for a moment the young people who are among us. I hear there are about 4,000 of you here today. The college students and high school students here today, perhaps for your very first policy conference. And I want to thank you for being here. And I want to thank you for standing tall for Israel, not just today, but every day. I know that it always isn't easy. Many of you are facing firsthand a movement to discredit and disparage Israel on campuses across America and around the world. I'm not talking about the kind of fruitful exchange of different perspectives that we welcome at our universities. College is, after all, a time to meet people with passionate beliefs that differ from your own. I'm talking about a movement that has crept into other causes you care deeply about. A movement increasingly forcing you to stay silent if you want to take an active role in campus politics, or in some cases to check your love of Israel outside the doors of the classroom. I'm referring, of course, to the growing boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, a campaign to boycott Israeli goods and Israeli scholars that treats the only democratic free market economy in the Middle East as the cause of all of the region's challenges. Now, the last time I checked, Israel stands alone in a desert full of despots that have no regard for democratic freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law. That's the Israel that I know. So let's be clear. I reject the BDS movement, whether it be on campuses in France and London or right here in the United States of America. BDS activists turn the other way as Bashar al-Assad and Vladimir Putin bomb civilians without hesitation. They ignore the cries of people being persecuted in Venezuela and Cuba. They claim the mantle of free speech to defend this smear campaign against Israel. They demand that Israeli academics in every field of study be silenced, that students who are Jewish, who are pro-Israel, and who believe in a lasting and secure home for the Jewish people are silenced. But we must not be silent. We must stand together to ensure that the letters BDS are seen for what they are: bias directed solely at one people and one country by those who should know better. And as a senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I will use every avenue at my disposal to call out a movement that is stained by anti-Semitism. Whether it is the delegitimization of Israel by the United Nations, the intimidation and isolation promoted by BDS, or the white nationalist dog whistles blown by Steve Bannon from the West Wing, it is up to all of us to stand up, to stand together and speak out against anti-Semitism in all of its forms. And that includes raising our voices together in rejecting anti-Semitism's close friends, racism and xenophobia. We see these forces of fear and division in the administration's support for policies that profile immigrants based on their chosen religion, the color of their complexion, the nation of their origin. And we hear it in the rhetoric designed to stoke fear of Syrian refugees, rhetoric that demonizes innocent families, calling out for refuge from the terrorists in ISIS. Refuge from the bombs dropped by Vladimir Putin. Refuge from the brutal dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. The scope of the humanitarian crisis spurred by the conflict in Syria reminds us that the entire Middle East is increasingly under siege. And for Israel, The threats posed by further instability are obvious. The increasing volatility we see deeply intensifies the deep concern felt by U.S. allies and partners, especially throughout the Gulf, that Iran will emerge as a nuclear-armed power. Now, as you all know, I have spent the better part of my 25 years in the House and Senate helping craft an extensive network of sanctions. Sanctions that ultimately weakened the Iranian economy and drove the regime to the negotiating table. Those sanctions were working exactly as intended. And I believe we should have pressed for more meaningful concessions and put more stringent constraints on Iran's nuclear capability in place. But whether you supported the Iran nuclear agreement or opposed it, as I did, surely we can all agree that a nuclear-armed Iran would pose an existential threat to Israel and an unacceptable threat to America's national security. Surely we can all agree that the time limits imposed on the regime are only a blink of an eye when we consider Iran's long history. We cannot deny that in a decade, we may be facing an Iran equipped with an unacceptable nuclear breakout time. So look, I know I don't need to tell this audience where the Iran nuclear agreement fell short. But as I said when I voted against the deal, if Iran is to acquire a nuclear bomb, it will not have my name on it. Now, many of us rightly predicted that an Iranian regime that prioritized funding terrorism over the well-being of its own citizens would see sanctions relief as a cash windfall for their terrorist proxies across the region. And on terrorism, we feared that much of Iran's new economic capacity would be used to propagate violence against Jews. It is no surprise, then, that Iran has not suddenly transformed into a responsible member of the international community. Rather, it remains an agent of instability throughout the Middle East, a nefarious actor that continues to undermine American national security interests and our efforts to partner with countries throughout the region, working to protect civilians and build democratic governance structures. Consider Syria. Even as the United States and our partners make progress at beating back ISIS and work together to deliver desperately needed humanitarian relief to besieged civilians, Bashar al-Assad presses on with his brutal campaign. And let's be honest, we all know that Assad's continued grip on power is thanks in large part to his allies in Moscow and his friends in Tehran. By aiding Assad, Russia is prolonging this conflict, all for the purposes of trying to maintain one friendly government in the Middle East who will stand by its own brutal leader. Meanwhile, as Russian bombs rain down on Syrian hospitals, as Russian bombs rain down on Syrian homes, as Russian bombs rain down on humanitarian aid convoys, Putin is content to sit back and watch Western Europe struggle with the displacement of millions of people, all the while spreading white nationalist and anti-Semitic propaganda aimed at swaying elections and undermining the post-World War II international order. Simultaneously, the Iranian regime is emboldened by sanctions relief and undeniably invested in Assad's grip on power. Iran continues to funnel cash and weapons to its pro-Assad terrorist proxy Hezbollah, weapons that at a moment's notice could be turned on Israel. Israel has every right to be concerned and every right to defend itself against any and all threats. Throughout this harrowing conflict in Syria, Israel has shown extraordinary restraint and a laser-like focus on defending the security of its people. But as this conflict literally at times spills over its borders, no country can endure this kind of provocation for long, and we may be facing a change in calculus. In recent days, we saw Syria launch missiles at Israeli air forces as they returned from destroying a convoy of weapons that was headed to the terrorists in Hezbollah. Those missiles triggered Israel's missile defense system for the first time since the conflict began. So, my friends, this is not a time to be naive. Iran's motives are no mystery. Its goal to extend the influence of its government throughout the region remains unchanged. Iran continues to support terrorist proxies like Hezbollah. It continues its provocative testing of ballistic missiles. It continues to disregard its international obligations, including its likely violation of a UN arms embargo. And the United States cannot let this destabilizing, aggressive behavior go unchecked. Which is why I have worked with my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, those who supported the nuclear deal and those who did not, to introduce the Countering Iran Destabilizing Activities Act just last week. Strong bipartisan support. With no indication that this administration has any proactive strategy to counter Iran, the time is ripe for Congress to assert its influence in our foreign policy, to provide guidance, and to develop a framework for securing our interests in the region. The bill contains meaningful steps to counter Iran's most egregious behavior, and I want to thank all of you for your steadfast support of it as you go to Capitol Hill today. It also calls for a regional strategy to counter Iran's asymmetric and conventional threats in the region. This includes specific plans to engage our partners in the Gulf to work together to counter Iranian efforts to destabilize recognized governments, to stop Iranian harassment and interference in international shipping lanes, to stop Iranian support for terrorist groups like Hezbollah and irregular Shia forces in places like Iraq. This bill also imposes sanctions on anyone who contributes materially or financially to Iran's ballistic missile program, a program that Iran has test-fired numerous ballistic missiles over the past few months, several bearing the words, "Israel must be wiped off the earth." And in January, the UN itself expressed concern that Iran's efforts to supply weapons and missiles to Hezbollah was in direct violation of a UN arms embargo. That's why this legislation imposes sanctions on anyone involved in such activities, ensuring that those who violate arms embargoes are held accountable. And to counter Iran's threatening support for terrorists, our bill imposes terrorism-related sanctions on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps far beyond the Quds Force, the Iranian regime's main exporter of terrorism. Likewise, it preserves sanctions imposed by executive order on individuals who support terror. Inside Iran, we also know this regime continues to abuse basic human rights. That's why our bill authorizes the president to sanction individuals who perpetuate human rights abuses through extrajudicial killings, the use of torture, and unjust detention. Indeed, we must never lose sight of those Americans as well who suffer at the hands of the Iranian regime, including those who have been unjustly detained and those who have remained missing in Iran for more than a decade. Now is not the time for the United States to turn a blind eye to Iran's hostile behavior. Now is the time for all of us to demand nothing less than vigorous oversight, constant vigilance, and strict enforcement of our entire arsenal of diplomatic tools, including sanctions and pressures on Iran. So let me conclude today with a message to those in this room who perhaps feel riddled sometimes by self-doubt or uncertain of the future. I'm reminded of the words of Israel's fearless and first ever Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. He said that to be a realist in Israel, you must believe in miracles. To every member of AIPAC, I urge you to heed those words. One battle loss should not undermine a bold vision. Remember, Israel was not founded on small ideas, but on bold principles. I won't deny that in times like these, with anti-Semitism on the rise, with Iran emboldened, with instability surrounding Israel at every turn, the path to a Jewish democratic state of Israel, secure at home and at peace with its neighbors, may seem elusive, at times maybe even impossible. It is in these times that we must strive to be those realists who believe in miracles. We must remember why we are pro-Israel, a position that I have always believed is one derived from the better angels of our nature. Hope over fear, democracy over despotism, human rights over hatred. In times like these, we must stay true to those better angels. We must reject those who say security and idealism are opposing goals instead of partners in peace. Together, we must stand unflinchingly and unapologetically for the safety and security of the State of Israel, all the while keeping our hands open and extended in the hopes that someday we feel the palm of another placed in ours, the palm of a fellow believer in miracles, the palm of a partner ready to work with Israel to fulfill the promise of peace. Remember that David Ben-Gurion believed in the promise, the miracle of the modern State of Israel long before Hitler's rise to power, back when he was a young man picking oranges in a kibbutz in 1906. So let us always remember that the argument for Israel's existence is born out of history, by farmers who made the desert green, by the discoveries of Nobel Prize winners, by the innovation of entrepreneurs, by a people not content to dream of miracles, but bold enough to realize them. As President John F. Kennedy said, Israel was not created in order to disappear. Israel will endure and flourish. It is the child of hope and the home of the brave. It can neither be broken by adversity nor demoralized by success. It carries the shield of democracy and it honors the sword of freedom. Together, we must be that shield, standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel in the face of adversity. That's why you're here in Washington. That's why I'm here standing with you, standing up for an Israel that is capable of defending itself against any and all threats, standing up for a nation that is not merely admired, but accepted on the world stage. Israel, strong, democratic, Jewish, and everlasting. Shalom. Thank you so much for having me.
In case you missed it on C-SPAN, Francie Hakes, National Coordinator for Child Exploitation Prevention during the Obama administration.
I used to think the hardest thing I would ever have to do was look into the eyes of a child and listen to her story about being abused. I was wrong. The hardest thing I ever had to do was watch their abuse. Sometimes still photos, sometimes video, sometimes with sound. All heart-wrenching and even now, impossible to forget.
Agriculture Secretary nominee Sonny Perdue.
Farmers are really struggling to be profitable, hold on, and many times even the best farmers are not able to produce a product even with the best production capabilities they may have. So I think trade is really the answer.
MSNBC's Chris Matthews at the First Amendment Awards dinner.
The truth contained in hard news, the truth that arrives on the front page or in the straight news broadcast, that's what contains the politician. That's what stops the overreach in power. And that's what the country takes seriously. And that's what matters this hour, this week, this time in our lives.
Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin on comprehensive tax reform.
The goals of tax reform, which are about creating a middle-income tax cut, about creating personal tax simplification and making U.S. businesses competitive, where we have a very high business tax rate and worldwide income. We're able to take the tax code and redesign things.
Pfizer CEO Ian Reid on pharmaceutical costs.
No one's using our medicines in the exchanges because the exchanges don't provide them access. So I think we do need to reform the healthcare, the way it's delivered, and the consequences will be with patients.
And EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt on environmental policy.
I mean, there's some exciting things going on with respect to clean coal technology across the globe. There's some exciting things going on in the nuclear space, but not here. Most of that's happening in Europe presently because of the disincentives that we've put into play here in this country with respect to nuclear. I mean, if you really care about some of these environmental concerns, nuclear ought to be in the mix.
C-SPAN programs are available at cspan.org, on our homepage, and by searching the video library.